getting all of our Zoom folks welcomed in from the waiting room here. We got some of y'all hopping on the Facebook machine over there, and maybe even on the YouTube. We're trying some new stuff to get as many folks able to participate in these as possible. So thanks for being here. We're just going to hang out for a minute because we got a lot of synchronizing that Kristin Snow from Red Letter Christians is doing on our end. So we're getting multiple Facebooks streaming, and you all are the early birds. So we're letting you in. We anticipate that some of the Zoom may fill up, but if you know anybody that wants to join that can't get on in on the Zoom, just let them know to join us on Facebook. We're also going to be recording all this, so it's going to be a powerful night. Thank you all for being here. I'll introduce a few other folks in just a minute, but we'll let everybody come in. So settle in, get your tea or coffee, hang out, and we'll get going in just a second here. And if y'all, I think some of us may be from the Christian liturgical tradition. It's Palm Sunday, which we were talking this morning about what a powerful thing it is to some of the themes of Kristin's book are very relevant to Palm Sunday, when Jesus did not enter Jerusalem on a stallion and a war horse with an entourage of soldiers, but rode in on a borrowed little baby donkey to kind of be this beautiful parody of power, sort of a photobomb to all of our militarism and power, was that Jesus's entry into Jerusalem. So it's kind of cool that this worked out to be on Palm Sunday. As folks keep trickling in, let me go ahead and say that I am really, really pumped that we have Rachel and Benjamin here, who are both going to be translating ASL. And they may be, they're coming in a second. I think we're figuring that out, right? The sign language piece of this. So we've got translation for those that are deaf and hearing impaired. We've done that at a bunch of our larger events, but we're new at doing this at some of the book club events. So hopefully this will become a regular thing. But thank you, Rachel and Benjamin, for being here. And incidentally, I kind of want to put you on the spot, Benjamin, but I don't know if I'm allowed to do that. But Benjamin heard that about the book that we're doing and got so stoked because he had read the book and was familiar with it. So they're both here, not just because they believe in translating, but also it feels like they really vibe and resonate with the conversation. So it's Kristin, that's also a great compliment to your book. So let me go ahead and introduce Kristin as well, who is kind of a new friend of mine. We've sort of known about each other for a while. We've done a few events together, but this is, I hope, the beginning of all kinds of cool collaborative work that we can do together. And Kristin Dumais is our guest, author that we're celebrating this month. And her latest book is Jesus and John Wayne, which I've got right here. Kristin, I got to tell you, like, how they're active listeners. I'm an active reader. So like, I just shredded it with like notes in the margins. I've got pages that are tacked, which means I'd like to quote that in a book that I'm writing, so
I love it.
I'm all over it. But thank you so much for being here. I'm just thrilled about the conversation we're going to have.
Oh, thank you. And I should say, I have known about you a lot longer than you have known about me. And so, Irresistible Revolution long ago, but really just, you've been a beacon, I think, within evangelicalism more broadly for such a long time. So it's an honor. It's a privilege.
It's going to be such a good conversation. And we're watching the chat, y'all, too. We're also kind of trying our best. Kristin Snow is watching Facebook. So please tell us where you're from. Tell us, some of y'all held your book up. You can do that again. That's pretty great if you've got it with you. And we'll try to keep an eye on some of the questions and be as interactive as we can be. And this is a series that we've been doing at Red Letter Christians, y'all. We started this year partly because of the pandemic, But also, we just thought, man, there's so many great folks that it's fun to read books together. So let's take advantage of the technology that, 2 years ago, I don't think many of us use Zoom like we do now, but we're able to get together like this. So we started earlier this year. I think you know this, Kristin, that we did Jamar Tisby's book, which was wonderful. And then we had Brenda Salter McNeil, and we're having Jesus and John Wayne this month. I'll tell y'all at the end again, but we're next month going to have Anthea Butler, Dr. Butler, White Evangelical Racism. This is going to be our book for April. But I want you first, Kristin. I know a little of your history, and I thought it was fantastic that you mentioned Dort, because that's a school that a lot of people haven't heard of, but I went to Dort right after, I believe it was right after Trump did his infamous line of, I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and not lose support. He said that on the stage there. So this is your stomping ground, right?
My place, my home. Yeah. Yeah. I grew up in Sioux Center, Iowa. So I went to Dort. My dad was a theology professor there. And yeah, that's my home. That's my space. So that's how I open this book, Jesus and John Wayne. But yeah, I grew up there. People ask all the time if I am an evangelical or if I consider myself one. And that's always a tricky question, because I grew up in this little Dutch Reformed enclave, right? This kind of immigrant community. And so we actually kind of identified against evangelicalism when I was growing up, that's not who we are. We're a little bit smarter, a little bit more intellectual, right? That was, kind of what I grew up with. And that said, I was fully immersed in the evangelical popular culture, right? Bookstores, and I only listened to Christian music, never the secular radio, things like that. So one foot in, one foot out. I went to Dort, ended up going to University of Notre Dame for a PhD in history. And then after a couple of stops along the way, ended up at Calvin University, where I still teach.
I think it's really helpful for folks to hear a little bit of that backstory, because you're not just a scholar studying evangelicalism. I mean, this is your people. You grew up immersed in this world. So I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about how that backdrop has shaped who you are, but and the bones that you've spit out, that from that. But I think it's important for people to hear that, really authentic backdrop from you of this is something you're not just studying, but you've been shaped by it.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that my own backstory explains a little bit the approach that I take in this book, which is that there's more to evangelicalism than just theology, right? There's more to evangelicalism than just kind of checking off beliefs, because I'm a confessional Christian and, grew up in a very kind of conservative tradition. And still, when I went off to graduate school, even though I went to Notre Dame, that's where I met kind of real evangelicals, because a lot of evangelical students were coming to study with my advisor, George Marsden, kind of the historian of evangelicalism at the time. And they were coming from Moody Bible Institute. They were coming from Bob Jones. They were coming from Wheaton. Like, they were coming from the real evangelical strongholds. And so I got to know evangelicalism in part through them. And really, again, my places of connection were the popular culture. And that's where I thought, okay, yes, I know what you're talking about, even though, I had to kind of figure out who Bob Jones was, coming from my neck of the woods as it was. But so I think that probably explains a little bit that there's theology that you can hold in common, but then there's cultural experience that you can share or be somewhat alien to. And so I think that also explains some of the questions that I brought to this book, and how this book is a different kind of history of evangelicalism than many that had been written before, which tend to focus more on kind of the intellectual traditions, the theologies, the institutions. And this is very much a popular history of evangelicalism.
Absolutely. And when you, I heard one of my mentors told me, when you write, you should write because you can't not write. Like, let the books choose you. And you really feel like, as you're flipping through these pages, that this is the fire in your bones, as Jeremiah said. So say a little bit more about like how you knew that this book needed to be written, and why it kind of was the song you needed to sing right now.
So that came through, did it? Yeah, it was. It was an obsession. So the roots of this book actually go back more than 15 years. My first or second year as a new prof at Calvin, I was teaching a U.S. survey course, and kind of scrambling, just fresh out of grad school. And so I decided to lecture one day on Teddy Roosevelt. And I thought it would be a really great way to show my Calvin students how gender worked in history, especially how masculinity worked, that masculinity changed over time, and it was connected to economic shifts, and it was connected to race and to religion and foreign policy and militarism. And so I gave this great little lecture on Roosevelt. And then right after class, a couple guys came up to me and they said, Professor Dumais, there's this book that you have to read. And actually keep it right here. This was the book, John Eldredge's Wild at Heart. So I literally went off to Family Christian Bookstore for $21.99, picked up a copy, and I opened it up and I saw exactly what they were talking about. Eldredge opens his book with a quote from Teddy Roosevelt, and then goes on to sketch, much like Roosevelt, this kind of militant conception of, Christian manhood. And, God is a warrior God, and every man is made in his image. Every man has a battle to fight. And so I thought, that's interesting. And this was back in 2005 or 2006. And I discovered that this was just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, his book went on to sell more than 4 million copies. And then there were dozens, if not hundreds of other books that were saying much the same thing by that time. This was also the early years of the Iraq War. And so at the same time as I was reading this militant Christian masculinity literature, I was seeing this survey data coming out that white evangelicals were far and away more supportive of the Iraq War, of preemptive war in general, more likely than any other Americans to condone the use of torture, to embrace an aggressive foreign policy. And I was just sitting with that. And then I just ask the question, what might one have to do with the other? So I started researching this a long time ago. And then I set it aside, partly because what I was discovering was so disturbing. And I wasn't sure I wanted to sit with this for that long. It was deeply misogynistic. It seemed anti-biblical to me. Again, really disturbing. And I had this question, is this fringe, right? Because it felt really extremist, even though I knew it was really popular. This is Mark Driscoll era and stuff too. And so I thought, as a Christian, is it my job to be shining this bright light on what might be the darkest underbelly of American Christianity? And so I set it aside. And I thought, I'll get back to it someday. And then I had a couple babies and then another baby. And then I wrote my first book on Christian feminism. And I just thought I'll get back to it at some point. And then it was the fall of 2016 in the wake of the Access Hollywood tapes, when I noticed the language I was hearing around evangelicals and their support for Trump reminded me an awful lot of what I had been reading all those years ago. And so I dusted off that research and decided to write a book. And at that point, the question of kind of margins or mainstream was clearer to me, and also the urgency of the project was. And I think that's the urgency that you sensed at that point.
Totally. And I want to say to folks, that are listening in, if some of these names or this is new to you, that's awesome. We'll explain some of the names and terms. We're going to dig a little bit deeper. And I told Kristin, I'm doing this broadcast tonight from my sister and brother-in-law's house, who go to the same church as Franklin Graham. So we're all kind of like processing this in a lot of different ways. So this is a safe place tonight. So just keep leaning into the conversation. And Kristin, as I was reading, one of the things that I've read quite a bit from folks that are looking historically at evangelicalism and talk about the fault line around race, right? Like, so Randall Balmer was on a panel that we had around abortion. Jamar Tisby was one of our guests, the color of compromise. And one of the things that they really help, I think, on is that this alignment between white evangelical Christianity and the Republican Party didn't come out of nowhere. And it wasn't actually originally around sexuality and abortion, right? Like, there was this kind of history of segregation and racism that the white evangelical church was trying to figure out how to navigate that. and abortion and saying, sexuality became a place that they could find some common ground, whereas on guns or nuclear weapons or other stuff they couldn't. So, but you help fill some of the gaps out on that, and I think you kind of help us see the masculinity, the kind of toxic masculinity piece of that. So I don't know if you want to maybe talk a little bit about how those intersect and they overlap, right? It's not like it was one or the other, but I think you help with a really important piece of this.
Yeah, at first I was just looking at masculinity, but masculinity always, or gender generally, always has to do with race. And as a scholar, I know that. But one of the things I noticed very early on when I was looking at books like Aldridge's and other copycat books that were really popular in the early 2000s was that, for all their talk of being Bible believing Christians, these evangelical writers weren't really drawing much on scriptures for their vision of masculinity. They were looking to Hollywood heroes, to mythical warriors, to Mel Gibson's William Wallace from the movie Braveheart, right? To cowboys. Cowboys were a favorite. Soldiers, General MacArthur, John Wayne, right, from the title of the book. And at a certain point, it dawned on me, these were all white men. The militant heroes that were celebrated, all white men. And many of them white men who had proved their kind of masculine heroism by using violence to subdue non-white populations. So Teddy Roosevelt is a great example, the Rough Rider, right? So many of John Wayne's movies, right? That's his brand. And so that kind of clued me in. And then when I went back to history, I saw, I draw on Balmer's work, I draw on Tisby's work, and I just saw how much this kind of in the Cold War era, this kind of militant white masculinity was it was linked to ideas of Christian nationalism. The idea that we need strong men to fight, to protect faith, family, and nation. So fight in the military, but also fight to defend Christianity domestically. And if you just take that concept of Christian America, Christian nationalism, the idea that like America was a Christian nation and everything was great until things went bad. And if you kind of follow their timeline, things went bad in the 1960s, right? That only makes sense if you're a white Christian, right? It makes no sense for Black Christians at all. So I started just looking for kind of clues here, right? Seeing how family values politics did emerge out of this, as Randy Balmer has suggested, defending white parents' rights to keep their kids in segregated schools. And so and they were really big on authority, white evangelicals, like who has proper authority, and parents have the authority and the father has the authority. But this was the authority of white parents to make choices for their kids, not the authority of Black parents to make choices for their kids, and the authority of white parents to keep the federal government out of their kids' education, which historical context, we're talking desegregation, right? That's what the federal government was trying to do in terms of interfering with their families. And so when you go into the history just a little bit, you see how central race was in that context. And then you have like this masculinity that somebody like, John Wayne came to embody, both on screen and off. It was a militant white masculinity, unapologetically so. Law and order politics, this again, use violence to bring order. It was entirely a militant white masculinity. And I think it's worth appreciating that, because often this kind of gets lost because the whiteness isn't made visible within, as people are describing it, but it's very visible to those who are not white, who are excluded from this.
Yeah, and as you're saying that, one of the things that I think it's Eddie Glaude and some other folks have said it in different ways, that America is not unique in its racism, in its violent history of what we did to indigenous people. But where we are unique is in the mythology that we have created to justify it and to hide that and to sort of baptize it, right? I'm interested in how you pick John Wayne and some of the other mythology that you began to unpack as like, wow, this isn't the history that really was, it's the history that we wish it was. Like we're kind of making this up, and we're creating ways that we kind of mythologize this racist history. So talk a little bit about why John Wayne and, you know, some of the other mythology that you unpacked became so prominent.
Yeah, John Wayne was not an evangelical. Need to make that very clear. Even though rumors consistently spread that he, over the decades that he had converted to evangelicalism, he did not. But he came to symbolize this, rugged, almost retrograde white patriarchy and this militancy, this old-fashioned manhood that seemed to be under siege by feminism. Then we had the anti-war activists, the hippies, and plus, civil rights movement. All these things really disrupting the authority of this, kind of old-fashioned white patriarchy. And so John Wayne became a kind of symbol of that. He was a symbol for conservative Americans generally, not just for white evangelicals. In fact, I think first he was for just conservative Americans. And he became the symbol by the 1960s, by the 1970s of, his movie Green Berets, which he directed as well, the only movie filmed during Vietnam that presented Vietnam in a heroic way. So he did become this kind of icon of conservative American manhood. And evangelicals were drawn to that. And so what we see here is this kind of alliance that is formed between conservative white evangelicals and many secular conservatives. And the alliance is a cultural one as well as political, right? So a cultural ideal of this traditional, quote unquote, traditional masculinity and then traditional femininity. And that becomes a really powerful kind of source of unity. And out of that flows the political alliances that we see take shape with the rise of the religious right and the new iteration of the Republican Party. But that mythology really is at the heart. And if you look for it, you see that it persists all the way up to the present, right? So just a few months ago, we had President Trump talk about this, wanting a garden of American heroes. And, which heroes did he want? These kind of rugged, mythical, heroic individuals, real or imagined, in the pattern of John Wayne, of Teddy Roosevelt, of General MacArthur, and so on.
Wow. And as you keep kind of tracking the trajectory of some of this, you mentioned a few of the ways that this kind of white evangelical and secular cultural alliance happened. And there are some, this is what you do in your whole book, is kind of paint that, but there are a few landmarks that were like, this is a really definitive moment right now. Reagan was one of those, a few others. And I don't know if you want to maybe paint with a broad brush a few of those that really concealed that alliance, right?
Yeah.
And I think the war in Iraq might have been a part of that, but say a little bit more about how, because it does feel like a weird partnership, strange bedfellows in some ways, but and the way that they aligned with John Wayne, even though he had been through 3 marriages. You're kind of like priming the pump to the last 4 years, but that kind of, it's powerful though, how those, you want to mention any more of those moments where you saw that alliance kind of fortified?
Sure. I was surprised through my research just how crucial Vietnam was, right? Vietnam is this pivotal period where a lot of Americans start to question American militarism. They start to question American goodness and greatness because they're seeing these reports come, on the evening news. And evangelicals, conservative white evangelicals, doubled down on pro-military, pro-America, pro-war. And, Billy Graham was right at the center of that. And that's one of the parts of this book that surprises a lot of evangelicals. I think it's a different side of Billy Graham in this book than we often see. And so Vietnam was just absolutely critical. And what I noticed when I started reading evangelical books on Christian manhood written from the 1990s on, so many of them go back to Vietnam. They open in Vietnam. They have to still wrestle with Vietnam. That's a kind of crisis moment when they felt that they had to sustain this rugged militant American masculinity, but felt they were doing so in opposition to so many other Americans, right? So Vietnam was critical. well. The opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment really did mobilize conservative evangelicals. I mean, Phyllis Schlafly, a Catholic, kind of helped lead the way there, but really linked foreign policy and American power to these domestic issues and quote unquote traditional masculinity and femininity. So that was important. You mentioned Reagan. The Reagan Carter election was a critical moment there in terms of understanding white evangelicalism. And, they preferred Ronald Reagan, kind of the tough guy, over Jimmy Carter, the Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher, for a variety of reasons, right? Foreign policy was key there. So that's an interesting moment. A couple of other moments in writing this book that I thought were really pivotal. One was the 1990s with the Promise Keepers movement, not because it was leaning into this militarism, but the opposite. The Cold War had ended. Things were up for grabs. And so that's where you have a lot of experimentation. They kept saying the word confusion kept popping up in sermons and speeches and books that I was reading from the 1990s. So they were experimenting with maybe egalitarianism, maybe a kinder, gentler, a soft patriarchy. We still want warriors, but we want tender warriors. And we can hug and we can cry and we can show our emotions. Oh, and we can also pursue racial reconciliation, right? So it seems this moment of kind of promise. By the end of the 90s, a lot of conservative evangelicals are saying, no, that went too far. It's getting a little too soft. We don't want tenderness anymore. Let's swing the pendulum back. And they do. And so in 2001, in those first months, that's when we have Wild at Heart published. That's when we have Dobson's Bringing Up Boys published, Doug Wilson's Future Men, all embracing this really rugged testosterone-driven masculinity. And those books are all on the shelves of Christian bookstores when terrorists attack the United States. And so it's September 11 that is going to just take this, like the pendulum was already swinging, but just amplifies this. And that was in those ensuing years. That's when I first realized, kind of started paying attention to what was going on. And the militancy, the militarism just really does, increase dramatically. And we're still, I think, very much living in that era today.
Mm-hmm. And so just to pick up on a couple of those themes, I sent you a copy of my Beating Guns book because there are so many things that you point out that I began to notice in my own upbringing. I mean, I read some of these books, but some of them, I think they weren't, like Wild at Heart. Some of those I didn't read, but I did grow up with guns.
Yes.
And I grew up very comfortable with guns. And then I began, I moved to Philadelphia, spent 20 years there, saw gun violence, up front. Mm-hmm. And the way I thought about guns obviously began to shift, both because of my theology and of my proximity. But one of the things that's stunning when I was researching for Beating Guns is that the highest gun owning demographic in America is white evangelical Christians. Yeah. It's like 41%. Almost half of white evangelicals have guns, whereas 2/3 of Americans don't have guns, right? Only 1/3 of Americans have guns. So we own guns at a higher rate than the general population. We're responsible for almost 90% of the gun deaths are by men. We even think of these horrific recent mass shootings, that it's kind of one of the obvious manifestations of that toxic masculinity. But one of the things that you point out, and that I love this book, I don't know if you read it was Pamela Haig's book. She wrote this powerful book that she said, one of the things that she says is you could look at history through the lens of male aggression versus female conscience. And that's a powerful statement, is because you think of the resistance to guns. It was women, it was moms. It still is. Moms demand action, right? You think of one of the stories that I mentioned to you was Sarah Winchester, who inherited the entire gun industry of the Winchester family and was haunted by it, was sickened by it, right? Teddy Roosevelt wanted to visit her because he was such a big fan of Winchester guns. And she was like, nah, I'm good. She wouldn't meet with him. So I want you to say a little bit more about that, because I think that toxic masculinity, it is theological, but we see it in so many of the things that you mentioned, our tolerance for torture as evangelicals is higher. Our like anger at immigrants is higher as white evangelicals than the general population. So those are haunting things to reckon with.
Yeah. Support for the death penalty, as you know, right? Um, yes. So you sent me the PDF. I actually have your book. So I just want to say this is a beautiful book. Like it's not just like beautiful words, but like how did you get your publisher to make this? It's like this magazine or so. So yes. And you'd asked, like we were chatting before, this question of masculinity versus a feminine conscience. And yeah, as a historian, I don't often kind of essentialize. I just kind of look at what's in front of me. So I can't say that women are by nature more, pacifist or peace loving, or just the way in which culture has formed individuals throughout a lot of human history, that this is kind of where we're at. But descriptively, I think there's a lot to be said for that, right? And also just descriptively, not without exception. So history is about, like, you see a lot of continuity, but you see a lot of change too. And so history is complicated. And as soon as you like scratch beneath the surface of some of these global statements, you'll see, oh, it's actually not always that way, right? So one of the things I tried to do in Jesus and John Wayne was give a quick glance back to the 19th century, mostly to destabilize a little bit of this. Because otherwise it can start to feel inevitable. Oh, boys will be boys, right? This is just the way men are. Oh, I guess God made them this way. And you just, that's exactly the path that many of these writers on Christian manhood take, instead of, looking for, complexity and maybe considering the effects of sin and all these things. So one of the things I try to do is show in the 19th century ideals of Christian masculinity, really centered self-restraint, right? A gentlemanly self-restraint, rather than this like unleash the warrior kind of thing. And so it's important to keep in mind that there's alternative ways to be a man and to think about being a man. And at the same time, throughout history, masculinity is always linked to power, right? Mm-hmm. To power, and then wielding that power is often, right, it's through aggression and through violence. And so there is a lot of continuity there as well. And it does seem that women are often kind of the conscience of this movement, protecting their children. My first book was on Christian feminism that emerged out of anti-trafficking activism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, part of the temperance movement, right? Trying to kind of push back against male abuses of power. And so throughout history, that does seem to be a thing. And like you say, up to the present day, in terms of moms organizing, that guns in our society and historically too have been very closely linked to masculinity, and also to whiteness, right? Who is allowed to wield weapons and who is not. And so they're linked to a kind of identity. And that's one thing, but then we can bring in the kind of Christian layer here too, right? And then say, what does a Christian identity do to this reality? Does it deconstruct it? Does it completely destabilize it? Does it do what the Jesus of the Gospels does, which is like, that's what you think, but my way is a completely different way. But instead, what we see in the history of white evangelicalism in the last half century is embracing that and then calling that Christian.
Yeah, and I don't want to paint too broad a brush or throw all the dudes under the bus, but I know there's a lot of people that are uncomfortable with the gender framework of this, but I mean, we can't miss the fingerprints that this has on our society. I mean, I even think this week, right, with that image of all the dudes and the governor in Georgia signing this, this bill of voter suppression, and then, the Representative Park Cannon, African-American woman, being arrested for knocking on the door, trying to be that conscience as these guys are signing that. So, it's still very real, that sin all the way back to Cain killing his brother Abel. And we look at, like 90% of homicides committed by men. Like these are not just things that we can ignore, that there is maybe it is just a toxic gender dynamic or something that we, align with masculinity. But I want you to talk a little bit about like some of the things that have happened that just reinforce I mean, like your book came out and it's not been out long and it's hit the bestseller list, and we're still seeing the truths that you name. I mean, like I mentioned in Georgia, but also like with Beth Moore leaving the Southern Baptist Convention, and the Me Too movement, all that. You're kind of you're bringing us into that era. But I don't know if you want to say more about the significance of what's happening right now in kind of real time in some of these traditionally patriarchal denominations like the Southern Baptist world. I mean, it feels like history is being written right now, right?
It really does. It does. It's a little dizzying, honestly, to be a historian. First of all, just writing a book up to the present was a new thing for me. In my first book, all the people I wrote about were long dead. And so like the past was in the past and it was stable. And as I was writing Jesus and John Wayne, like the history was happening around me. And then I had to go through this anxiety inducing period for a year where it was with my publisher and in production and, watching what was happening. We had an impeachment and we had a global pandemic and we had Black Lives Matter and we had all of this, and all of these things just kind of lined up with what I had mapped out. And then, of course, the election and January 6th, the events of January 6th in particular, I think brought a question of white Christian militancy to the fore. We had Beth Moore, who was in this book as one of these voices of conscience, right? Early on in 2016 and then through the Trump years. And I know she's read the book and she's commented on it a number of times and come out defending it on Twitter, and did so just a few days before she announced that she was leaving the SBC. And then of course we had the horrific Atlanta shooting a couple of weeks ago as well, that brings some of these questions to the fore. In terms of purity culture, in terms of white Christian masculinity and violence, and how much of this is just an individual, and how much of this is a culture, and of course those aren't mutually exclusive. So what I see happening in white evangelical spaces right now is a kind of evangelical reckoning, as Ed Stetzer suggested. I see that happening. It really runs deep on an individual level. I have heard since this book came out, I've received so many hundreds of letters from evangelicals themselves saying, this is the story of my life. And thank you for writing this, because I never understood how all these pieces fit together. Like I did this, I bought this, I listened to this, I was formed by this, but I never really understood, right, just how it all comes together. And so for those people, there are many people who are deconstructing, not like their entire Christian faith at all. Actually, they're trying to like take off these cultural layers of things that had been packaged and sold as Orthodox Christianity, which they're realizing now that that's not biblical Christianity. And so that is, it's actually a really kind of exciting moment in some ways. But what I don't see happening is I don't see institutional change. Mm-hmm. So what I see a lot of is people like Beth Moore, who are the voices of resistance. They push back, and then finally they say, this is not who I am, and they leave that space. And then their voice is no longer in that space. Mm. And I see that in churches, I see that in Christian schools, in Christian organizations. Either their voices are silenced or they end up leaving. And so I'm very hopeful in terms of the change that I see, which is real on an individual level. On a broader institutional level, I'm much less hopeful.
Wow. Okay, man, we might need another hour, but anyway, we're gonna keep digging. But I want to keep exploring this a little bit, because I see a lot of white evangelicals that are leaving that, right? But what we keep saying at Red Letter Christians is like, leaving Trump evangelicalism may not be the end of your faith. That may be the beginning of of a more authentic, robust faith and theology. So like, we need to see that the spirit's at work outside of white evangelicalism. And in some ways, it can still be confining and centering of whiteness to say, I'm done with Christianity because I'm done with this particular version of it, right? So
Yes.
I think in some ways, Black women have been the conscience of our country. We think of the last election, but you even, we often think about the 81% of white evangelicals that supported Trump. What folks don't often think about as much as we should is that over 80% of non-white Christians were opposing Trump.
Yes.
Right. So, I mean, it's almost this like exact opposite mirror. So where, like, as you think of that, like, you're very legitimately a friendly critic of the white evangelical contradictions and hypocrisy, but there is machismo that's in other parts of the church. I mean, there's plenty of folks that grew up in the Black church that I've heard critique this, kind of male patriarchy. There's, it's in the Latino church in a lot of places.
Yes.
So I don't know if you want to, you're very focused on, I think, kind of getting the log out of our own eye of white evangelicalism. But if you want to say more about how the fingerprints of this kind of masculinity are in other parts of the church, but also like, where can we find some hope and some life, as people are leaving that, looking for a more authentic faith?
Yeah. Yes, this is not so kind of patriarchy, and even a more militant patriarchy is not exclusive to white evangelicalism, although white evangelicals, I think, are at the forefront, it's fair to say. And so I was paying attention to other traditions as I was writing this book, and also white Catholicism. And Latino evangelicalism in particular is where you see the most affinities between the story I tell about white evangelicalism and kind of militant masculinity. And I think perhaps not coincidentally, that's where we see higher numbers of support for Trump in terms of Latinos, looking particularly at Latino evangelicalism. And there you see also kind of cultural affinities between a culture of machismo and then these religious teachings. In Black Protestantism, I talked with a number of people as I was writing this, and again, I'm a historian, and so I have my specialties, and my specialty is more white Christianity in terms of my training. So I try to talk about things that I know a lot about, but then keep an eye on other traditions and check in with scholars elsewhere. What I had seen is that in the Black church, there is more, relatively speaking, more of an emphasis on fatherhood in terms of Christian masculinity, and less of this militancy calling it Christian. But I've also heard from a number of Black Christians since this book has come out saying, thank you, because we have a problem over here we need to deal with as well, right? And so that I just don't have the expertise, but I would trust people who do have the expertise and on the inside to be able to sift through that, I think, a little bit more effectively. So what I will say, however, is we also have to contextualize this. So it's not just patriarchy that we're talking about, and it's not even just militant masculinity that we're talking about. In the story I tell, these things are linked to white Christian nationalism. Right. And so that's going to be a big difference. If you're going to look to Black Protestant communities, you are not going to, obviously the white Christian nationalism, but Christian nationalism looks entirely different. It's more of a prophetic tradition, which is really another thing entirely. And so when you have white Christian nationalism, this idea of Christian America linked to militant masculinity, that's really the story that I'm telling. And that is something that is quite distinctively white evangelical. And you'll see a parallel kind of version in conservative white Catholicism as well. So categories are important here.
Really, that's really helpful. And this is my other book that I've been rereading. I kind of have read Taking America Back for God. The Whitehead and Perry really dive into like Christian nationalism, and it overlaps with some of your themes. And as we think of nationalism and Christian nationalism in particular, what are some of the handholds that you feel like you're finding hope, that folks are beginning to identify sort of the principality and power of this, and And what are some ways forward, because I think you start to name some of those, and there's others that are going, identifying the problem's a good place to start, but then where do we go from here?
Yeah, I have to confess that as a historian, this is what we do. We identify the problems. And so I'm in this awkward position of having to, tell the white evangelical church what to do next. I'm always a little sheepish to move in that direction. But what I will say is that
that's all right. You just put on your prophetic hat. You just come on.
Right. I mean, if you're going to ask me, I'll tell you what to do. So, I had very little hope when I finished this book, and I've told this story before, but when it was a real kind of crunch to get it into production in time to come out in advance of the 2020 election. And that was our goal, and it needed to be. And so time was really tight, and we're just about ready to wrap it up. And my editor sends me this email saying, one more thing. It's really depressing, and you can't leave your readers here. You can't do this to your readers. And so he's like, you got to give us something to work with in your conclusion. And so I sat with it for hours, and I looked at the manuscript again. And then I just wrote him, I said, I'm sorry, I've got nothing. I feel as bad as you do right now. This is not good. It's not good at all. And he said, okay, I respect that. And then the next day or 2 days later, I get another email from him saying, just give us something, anything. And so that's when I gave him the last sentence of the book. What was once done might also be undone. And honestly, I was embarrassed to send that. I just thought this is so feeble, right? It's not enough. But he's like, okay, I'll take it. And the book went into production. And but there is power there. There is truth. And I'm seeing it. And I'm so glad that sentence is there, because I know so many readers are holding on to it because they didn't understand, even though this was their life story. I mean, I hear so many stories that in great detail show how their lives mapped onto the story I tell in this book. And yet they find it shocking. And that's something I've had to kind of grapple with. How could you not be aware, right? How could you not be clued in? And I've done some thinking on that, but mostly now that they see, they're like, right? What can we do now? And there is this real motivation to reject this.
Yeah.
And that sentiment was there, but they didn't even weren't even able to articulate exactly what we're rejecting here, right? Patriotism seems good. And so much of this is just in the air we breathe as white Christians, or as, if you go in these evangelical spaces. And I love to go into Hobby Lobby just to take the pulse of the evangelical world. And you'll see Blue Lives Matter flags for wall decor, and you'll see all this Christian nationalism decor and all of this. And it's just like Christianity, right? Until you name it. Until you hold it up and then say, is this really? Where did this come from? And what history does is it shows us, again, things have not always been this way. So then how did they get to be this way? And people made choices, individuals, and we can isolate some of those. And then we can look at motivations. And more often than not, they were making these decisions in order to enhance their own power. And right. And then we can start peeling away and say, I don't think so. And you can get back again. This is the kind of deconstruction, not deconstructing the faith, deconstructing all the cultural baggage that has corrupted the faith.
So good. Now I'm going to ask you a little bit of a personal question I didn't have on your little list that I sent you. Okay. But I feel like it would be really helpful for people to know, do you have a faith community you're a part of right now? Do you have a place where you're finding, a spiritual lifeline? Because I think there's a lot of people that are leaving something but aren't finding anything else.
Yes, I do. I have a wonderful church home. It's a Christian Reformed congregation just down the street here. Called Church of the Servant. So you can Google it, Church of the Servant, Grand Rapids. You can find our sermons online. They are beautiful. I love them. One of our pastors is from Ireland. And so, she can approach religious nationalism in a in a very powerful way from a different context. And it's also, we have a basic English service. So we have a lot of immigrants and refugees who are part of our church community. And so it's a wonderful, vibrant space where I am spiritually fed every week, remotely still, hopefully in person very soon again. And so, yes, I've been extremely fortunate to have this space where confessional Christianity, traditional liturgies, and really the global Christian community comes together. And I know it's hard. I know it's hard to find church homes. And to get back to an issue you raised earlier, I just wanted to add or reinforce that this question for many white evangelicals. I think I know that they've been kind of discipled in a way that makes them think that white evangelicalism is Christianity, right? It's the most faithful Christianity. And so seeing white evangelicalism kind of crumble before their eyes feels like their faith, like Christianity itself is crumbling. And that is just not true. And so I tell people too, it's like, how can I fix this? What can I do? I'm like, maybe you don't need to. Maybe you can just go find places right now where the faith is thriving, because it is thriving. And maybe you need to go to the places, people that you've excluded from your fellowship, the people that you have, maybe crossed some of those racial lines, or whatever other lines you have drawn or have been drawn around your communities, and go find where the faith is flourishing, and just relax. And, it's not up to you to fix this.
Wow. There's been a few questions that have been posted, so we got just a few minutes left, y'all, and feel free to keep posting questions, and we've got there's hundreds of y'all watching on Facebook and YouTube, and a bunch of folks on Zoom here, so throw a few questions out. But this is one of them that someone asked, Kristin, is could you say a little bit more about economics and how capitalism, and because I think of Dr. King when he named the three triplets of evil, right? And he named them as materialism, militarism, and racism. And he said they're really interlocked. And you talk about capitalism and the role that it plays in reinforcing some of these. Do you want to say more about that?
Oh, I could talk for another hour just on this, right? On this consumer culture and how that shaped, in so many ways, shaped the substance of evangelicalism, the substance of American Christianity. Whenever possible in this book, I try to make money visible. Whenever money's changing hands, I mean, you sell 4 million copies of a book. Do you know what? Well, you do know what kind of royalties that would be, right? It's not royalties that you and I have ever seen, but that's a lot of money. These conference circuits, right? This is money changing hands. Your book being, published and distributed through Lifeway Christian Books. That's a lot of money, right? That's just, capitalism and this consumer culture. Oh, let's talk radio. Let's talk, televangelism, but also these organizations of the religious right? So much money is changing hands, the donations that come pouring in, and loyalty, which is loyalty to the leader, but also loyalty to the brand, which is consumer loyalty, is often kind of bought through stoking fear. Right, through making people afraid of secular, mainstream media. Don't go there, stay within, say, listen to our channels, listen to our, read our books. Don't go out there, listen to our music. That's to control the message, but it's also, there's a ton of profits that are at stake if you go outside the fold, right? Again, I never listened to the top 40, as we called it back in the day, right? Only Christian contemporary music, contemporary Christian music. And artists corrected me recently. I have it wrong in the book. I grew up calling it Christian contemporary. Anyway, that's changed in the paperback. I digress. So that this is a business. Massive amounts of money are changing hands. And so that also means even these evangelical parachurch organizations, right? They're always described as ministries, but they're businesses. And so right now, what I see happening is many times even leaders know they want to dissent. They want to speak out against Christian nationalism. They want to speak out boldly against racism, but they don't, because they don't want to lose their subscribers. They don't want to lose their donors. They don't want to, disrupt the ministry. And there's all kinds of justifications that I hear, but ultimately we got to keep this business afloat, right, for the sake of the ministry. But I think that the way that that capitalism works here means that there are an awful lot of people within white evangelicalism right now who are staying quiet, who are protecting the brand, and at enormous cost to Christianity, and just to our country and to the world, frankly.
Yeah, and I think it's true with our guns too, right? Henry Ford said, if you want to know how to end violence, just figure out who's profiting from it. It's true of our military economy, right? That there's tons of people that are making a massive money off of Lockheed Martin, Boeing, off of the enormous ongoing endless wars. But you mentioned something that I think so important. You do this in the book too. This fear, right? Some have named this white fragility, this white fear, that the changing demographics of America, where the white evangelicals are not the dominant majority of Americans. And it was on the back of the first Black president that there's this kind of white lash, this backlash of white supremacy, reacting to the Black Lives Matter movement, the changing demographics of Congress. So there's all of this kind of fear and fragility that's there, and sort of a nostalgia, right? Of let's go back rather than forward. And I really just think that scripture, that perfect love casteth out fear, it might sound a little cliche, but I really feel like fear and love are at war. They're at war right now in our country, right? And whether we think about immigration or guns, the question is kind of like, who are we as a country, and what would it look like if love rather than fear was the motivating force that's shaping our imagination, right? And you talk about that some. I don't know if you want to say more about what role fear plays, and how you can combat that, because it's kind of hard to know how to start.
I thought about opening this book actually with Marilyn Robinson's quote, fear is not a Christian habit of mind, which, I love that quote, but I thought I can't, because historically that's not defensible. In the history that I'm telling, fear absolutely is a Christian habit of mind, right? And so I'm going to stick with the historian's take right now and just have to spell it out. So yes, early on I was kind of working with this assumption that fear is this kind of response to kind of naturally occurring events. So we have the demographic change. And, when we saw the evangelical support for Trump in 2016, the kind of media narrative was, an evangelical narrative actually, and the part of leadership was evangelicals were so afraid, right? You do have the demographic changes, and you have the, threats to religious liberty. And so what choice did they have but to go running into the arms of, their ultimate fighting champion, the man who would protect them, who promised to protect them. But then when I looked to the history, I realized at a certain point that we need to flip the script, that fear doesn't produce militancy. Historically, it's usually the opposite, that the militant leaders, people like Jerry Falwell Sr., Mark Driscoll, right, that they are actively stoking fear in the hearts of their followers in order to justify their own militancy and consolidate their own power. And once that clicked for me, and it really actually did in the chapter where I'm describing these fake ex-Muslim terrorists, right, that were all the rage post 9/11. Focus on the Family was sponsoring them, and CBN and the SBC and stuff. And this was a big deal. Turns out all these guys were frauds, like complete and utter frauds. And the people sponsoring them knew it. And they kept parading them out to tell white American Christians that Muslims were out to kill them and their children. And that's when I realized, right, this is not, the fear is manufactured. And so the fear is legitimate. That their followers are very legitimately afraid of Muslims, of secular humanists, of liberals, of feminists, of, fill in the blank. But I think, how do we undo this? I think the most important thing we need to do is be very curious about who is stoking the fear, right? Who is manufacturing this fear? Because we can talk about, oh, the Bible says, fear not, a lot. It says fear not. But we have many leaders actively stoking fear, because then people are going to donate. People are going to pledge their loyalty, right? As Driscoll said, hey, this is war. I demand absolute sacrifice and absolute loyalty. So we just need to understand, rethink this relationship, that militancy actually requires the continual stoking of fear. So we should be much more suspicious.
Wow. When you were saying that, I was, I don't know why this occurred to me, but when you were sharing about the fear and the things you just said, I was thinking, when I was in Iraq, I was in Iraq in 2003 during the bombing of Baghdad, and all of the military occupation that was happening there. But there was this one moment that I always remember right at Easter, because it was around this time that we were there, and we were having a birthday party for a young woman, 13 years old, named Amal. Her name in Arabic means hope. And as we're throwing this birthday party, the bombs start falling on Baghdad. And this was in the shock and awe campaign, and as those bombs started falling, all the adults were like, all right, we gotta get out of here. And the kids were like, they had just this fearlessness, and they said, no, we have to keep the party going, and Amal like hit me in the head with a balloon, and we kept the party going. And I remember, like, that 13-year-old, it wasn't this naivety, but it was this sense that no matter what they do,
yes,
we're going to keep the joy, we're going to keep the hope, we're going to keep the party going. And it maybe isn't that surprising that it came from a 13-year-old girl named Amal, right?
yeah.
But yeah, oh man. Well, anyway, it's been almost an hour. It flew by for me. I want to make sure I give you a chance. If there's anything else that you want to close us off with, I always like, I hate when you do an interview or podcast or something, and you have something that, you wanted to say that you didn't get to. So I sure want to thank you for this great conversation, and let you have the last word if there's anything you want to say in closing, and then I'll just make a couple of announcements. So.
Sure. Well, thank you for all of these questions, for your own work, and for the community that you've really cultivated here in this space. I think any closing thoughts would have to do with that sense of community that I'm hearing from so many evangelicals, former evangelicals, general readers, who feel really isolated right now, who feel like they are, the last 30 years have been a lie. I'm hearing that from evangelical leaders, powerful evangelical leaders, saying, what have I done? People who are thinking they need to walk away from their church communities, from their jobs. And so it is I think a really lonely time. But I'm hearing from so many. So I've just started telling people that there are a lot of us on the other side, or moving to the other side, right? It's not a lonely space at all. And what I found is that when I started writing on this, even before the book came out, I started connecting with other people, right? And those relationships are incredibly life-giving. And like you say, that's where joy is. And that's also where courage is found, I think, in that community. And so I think we just have to continue to find each other and to support each other and see what we can build on the other side.
So great. That was also a wonderful segue. That part of one of the great joys of this conversation is Kristin is now one of the many voices on our website at Red Letter Christians, because one of the things that we're convinced of is that part of how we change the narrative is by changing the narrators, right? And amplifying voices that have a beautiful, resilient faith like Kristin. It's a gift to have this conversation tonight, but you can keep hearing more from her and keep in touch with things that she's doing on our website. But also, do you want to let people know how they can keep in touch with you, Kristin, on your own socials and stuff?
Sure. I'm on Twitter too much at KK so that's KKDUMEZ, like Dumez. I'm also on Facebook, Kristin Kobus Dumais. I have an author page there, and I have a website, kristindumais.com, where I have I post a lot of the things that I write there.
Cool. And so we'll keep letting people know about that, and let folks know about our website too. Everybody, all y'all listening in, that like part of what we're trying to do is have voices like Kristin's and really diverse voices around the country that are singing a better song, right? That are living out a Christianity that is about Jesus and that's about justice and countering the narrative of Christian nationalism and white supremacy. So on that note, it's exciting to announce that Dr. Butler is going to be our next book next month. We'll put all this on the socials, but her book, I just got it today, White Evangelical Racism. She'll be our guest the last Sunday in April. A couple other things on the horizon are we do common prayer from our prayer book. This little book here that it's like 30 of us help create this daily prayer book together. And so we get together on the first of the month and we get to have a different guest. So the Bishop Yvette Flunder is going to be our guest on April 1st. So you can prepare to join us. We're going to be going a little bit later because she's on West Coast time, but all that's on our socials. But and we record those just like tonight. We're doing a couple of things around the Holy Week. I'm going to share some reflections on Good Friday when we remember Jesus's execution, and share a little bit about why that's significant. Jesus's execution and what it means for us today on this Friday at 2:00. I think that's when we're doing that. We got a great Easter concert that we're going to do on Monday, the Monday after Easter, April 5th. We've got 20 or more artists, spoken word, poetry, singer songwriters, bands that are going to sing songs of redemption, survival, resurrection, Easter songs. So that's on Monday night at like 7:00, I think it is. And all of this stuff we're trying to do for free. But we love to show some love to folks like Kristin. So if you can donate, we would love it if you do that. We're going to keep trying to offer things for free because we never want money to be an obstacle to folks that are leaning into conversations like this. So that means that those of us that can, give $10 or $20, just go to our website and do that if you don't mind. If you can share a little funds with us and sign up to be on our lists and whatnot, so we can keep in touch with you in the future. So what a great night. Kristin, you are a gift. Your friendship's a gift. Your proclamation of your faith is beautiful. So thank you for everything tonight. Thank you all for joining us, and join us, keep in touch with us. So love y'all. Kristin, any closing words?
No, just thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Benjamin, for your ASL translation. We'll do our best to make sure that we have that in the future. So thank you. Beautiful.